We have an incredible keynote speaker, Tanya Ortiz Franklin. She has extensive experience in education, and she is currently the board member for District 7 of the Los Angeles Unified School District, works in public service, great advocate to have here, and you get to hear from her for a couple minutes, and then you get to just do Q&A with her as well. So keep your questions coming. We're really, really excited to have you be so engaged. So please give her a round of applause.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I feel like we should be dancing in here. The lights are kind of like clubbish, right? You don't know about that, though. You don't know about that. I'm just kidding. I'm Tanya Ortiz Franklin. I'm so excited to be with you all today. I was actually a part of this panel last year, and they invited me to come back to spend a little bit more time with you, which I was so grateful for because I remember being in your seat, being a young woman interested in leadership and advocacy, and it helped. Every story I heard was just more motivation, more ideas for like what my career path might be. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey. And as you heard, spent a lot of time just with Q&A, so feel free to start jotting some questions down. And I'll also, if I remember, tell you about a couple of girls that I've been working with lately who've been really blowing my mind. So I grew up in Los Angeles Unified as a kid, and I start my story there because that's where you heard I work now. But about 20-ish years ago, when I was a student, it was really common for less than half of us to graduate high school. Now, less than half today are eligible for college, which is still a big problem, considering college, in my perspective, is such the right trajectory to get you to any career path you want. But I remember being 17 and asking my assistant principal, because I was one of the graduation speakers, what can I say that's like motivating for us here? Like, how many of us started as freshmen and how many of us walked the stage as seniors? So he had to like look it up, and he was like, well, freshman year, you were about 1,000 students. Senior year, you're 420 walking the stage. And this was in 2001. And that hit me because I thought, that sucks. Like, what happened to the other 500 something classmates that I had? Where did they go? What's their journey going to be like? And did I even know them as a student? Because then I started to feel some sort of guilt, right? So I remember taking that with me to college. I went to Columbia in New York City, which was very different than my 50% graduation rate high school experience. I was one of few Pell Grant recipients, one of few students of color back then. But Columbia was the most diverse school I applied to, and that was important for me. I wanted to meet other Latinas. I wanted to meet other people of color who traveled across the country for a cool college experience and wanted to change the world. And I did, but not right away. My first roommates, there were 4 of us, were 3 white women from the East Coast who like all paid $50,000 a year for their college education. So that was my like welcome to Columbia experience. Now I think it's a little bit more distributed evenly, I think, around students of color, students from low-income families. But I share that with you, both my high school and my college kind of beginnings, because no matter what sort of challenges you are experiencing, either now or in the future, I think it's important to remember those stories and like what drives you to make the decisions that you make and who you're working for, who you're serving. So I was an only child, but I had a lot of friends who had younger siblings who wanted them to go to college. And I had a lot of friends right out of high school who had kids and wanted their kids to go to college. And so for me, just accessing college and higher education really became like a pinpoint of what I wanted to do with my career. So when I was in college, I had a work-study job. I actually got paid to tutor kids, which was super fun, because that became then my career trajectory. I tutored kids in Harlem who were like a 20-minute walk from my college, and many had never been on my Ivy League campus. We would do these field trips, and once a year do like a carnival and bring them onto campus. And it's kind of like USC, where a lot of the neighboring communities like don't actually come to the campus. Like it feels like maybe it's not for you, or like why would I go there, or is that a place I'd go in the future? So anyway, I did that during undergrad with this program called America Reads, which was all about leadership and service. And then I applied as a senior to Teach for America. And that's actually how I became a teacher in Los Angeles Unified. Again, an AmeriCorps program really about service and leadership. And at some points, advocacy, which I think part of your leadership experience is about. So I came back to LA after college. I taught 6th grade. Anybody remember 6th grade, middle school, end of elementary school? Best years of your life, right? Middle school is often like, But I loved middle school because I felt like that's when kids were really like figuring out who they are. They're like learning how to cuss and like in the whisper, they're like kind of figuring out if they like somebody or not. But it was so fun for me to teach English and history to my students who I hope then would go to great colleges like USC and Columbia. But I was only a classroom teacher for 5 years because back then we had a big recession and I got laid off with 1,000 other teachers in Los Angeles Unified. And getting laid off is great motivation for wanting to do something different. So I went to law school. I went to UCLA, go Bruins, just have to say it. We always do in LA, right? Trojans, Bruins, love everywhere. But I went to UCLA and I loved the public interest program. I loved critical race studies. Some people don't want to talk about critical race theory today. I actually have a specialization in it because I think it's so crucial that we talk about how race and policy and the law interact and keep some people in certain places, right? You keep wealthy white folks in positions of power and often poor folks of color in not positions of power. And it's okay to talk about these things and it's okay to make policy with these ideas in mind. And that's actually what I do every day on the school board for LA Unified. So I was elected a little more than 2 years ago in November of 2020. It was my first election, and these races are intense. People raise thousands, if not millions of dollars to just represent their community. I represent 600,000 residents. Our school district is the second largest in the country, and we have almost 500,000 students in the school district, but I am beholden to my families from South Los Angeles through the Harbor and San Pedro areas who voted for me to do right by them, to manage a superintendent. I don't know if you've heard the name Alberto Carvalho or seen any signs the last couple of days. LA Unified had some workers on strike that just ended on Thursday. Happy to chat about that too. But it's my job to be his boss, actually. And I love going to schools and I love talking to families and saying, I'm his boss. He's the boss of the second largest school district in the country. But you know who my boss is? The parents. And eventually the students, because every 4 years they decide whether or not I'm doing a good job and if I should stay in my position or if somebody else should replace me, right? And that's kind of how politics works. You have all of this like checks and balances. So I mentioned, big part of my job is managing the superintendent, but the other big part of my job is managing a $20 billion budget. It's a lot of money. You can do almost anything with $20 billion, but believe it or not, you can't do everything. So we still have to make hard choices. And so some of the things that I've been able to do as a school board member during the pandemic, we said every kid needs the internet and not just a hotspot, but we should be paying for high-speed broadband internet in people's homes. And now we do. We pay for 100,000 kids to get either Spectrum or AT&T because I wrote a policy that said we need to do that. Like, that's kind of cool, right? I got to do that. I actually wrote a policy from, thanks. I wrote a policy from young people. They came to me about a year ago and they said, it's not fair that some students get art in every subject area. They get music, dance, theater, visual arts, and digital arts from elementary through high school, and others get nothing or they get like one piece of it. Can we do something about that? And so we're starting to. It's a really long process, but we're starting to look at which kids get access to which programs and what should we do differently to make sure every kid gets access to all of the arts. And I did that honestly because a girl came to me and said we need to do this differently. So we wrote a resolution together. I also wrote a policy about grading. Any of you ever feel like your grades are unfair? Like, man, I shouldn't have got that grade. Well, there's actually a better way to grade that's called mastery-based learning and grading, where it's about, do you know the content? And if you didn't learn it the first time, can you get another chance? And if something is late, you shouldn't be marked down for it. And why is it that you're on a scale of 0 to 100 with like 50 ways to fail and only 10 ways to get an A? Let's change that scale, right? So we wrote a policy to change the way people grade in Los Angeles Unified. So these are some of the things that I get to do in politics, which are really cool, but don't always have common agreement. There's 7 of us on the school board. Only 7. This is not like Congress. This is not like the state assembly where there are hundreds of representatives. There's only 7 of us. And we can sometimes disagree so vehemently in these like small backdoor conversations about basic things, like how do you define equity? So I proposed a definition for equity for my colleagues, and I said, equity is not equality. We constantly confuse them. Equality is everyone gets the same. Equity in my mind is everyone gets what they need, which is different. Some people need more, some people need less, some people need A, some people need B, but in a school system that treats everyone the same, it's really hard to shift from equality to equity. So we like fight about these things, right? But the majority was on my side when I proposed a definition and we won. Well, there was an election in November of 2022, and the balance of power switched, and things could change. That's kind of how this all works in politics, right? You get a voice for so long, and for me, for my voice, I want to use it as long as I can for the people who elected me, who are often the people who've been pushed farthest to the margins. So when I think about policy making, I think about advocacy, I think about doing right by my community, I'm constantly thinking about Black students. I'm thinking about English language learners. I'm thinking about undocumented families. I'm thinking about low-income wage earners. I'm thinking about people who are struggling to put food on the table, who are struggling to make rent. LA is growing more and more expensive every day, and they may not always be the ones at the polls fighting for me to keep my seat, but I have to be the one fighting for them because they deserve elected officials who will always put them first. So that's a little bit how I think about my job. I told you I was going to tell you about some girls who are doing some cool things too. So I represent the neighborhood of Watts, which is where the 110 and the 105 meet, essentially. And there's a lot of environmental justice issues there. So there's the planes flying overhead, there's the freeway traffic, there's the corridor, the Alameda corridor with a bunch of trains coming. And right next door to one of my biggest high schools is a metal recycling plant. I had never even heard of what these things were. But metal recycling is like you can bring scrap metal and get some money for it, just like you might for cans or for plastic bottles, but they've made these huge, huge piles that have this loud, loud noise, and sometimes dust comes over, and sometimes projectiles come over onto the campus. And the students at the school, and namely Genesis and Heaven, 2 female seniors this year, have said, this is not cool. This should not exist next door to a high school facility, even though it's been there for over 40 years. And because of their advocacy, now several groups in the neighborhood are fighting this, and they've been on the news, they've been on ABC 7. There was a movie made about Heaven just recently from the BBC, which is so cool, because students raised their voice and said, we need people to pay attention to our community and to do something about this plant that really shouldn't exist right next to a high school. It's an incompatible use. Send it somewhere else, because we want a park, or we want an aquatic center, or we want something else really cool. So anyway, I share their story with you because in my job as a public servant, which is really how I see myself as an elected official, I get to listen to young people, and I love it, especially when it's young girls, saying, here's what we need to do differently in my community. Here's how you can do right by my family, by my friends, and by future students who are going to come here. Speaking of future students, I just became a mom. I have a 5-month-old baby at home. I'll show you a picture. She's great. And, makes me think really differently about school. I took a long time to decide to become a mom, and it's nuts to me now how many people trust strangers, essentially, to take care of their babies. And your parents trusted lots of teachers, lots of educators, and school staff members to take care of you like their babies, and maybe someday you might have babies that the school system will take care of. And that is really significant. That's like your heart, like your whole heart. So I would love if any of you are interested in pursuing public service, if you're interested in pursuing public education, or in general, anything about politics or political science. That was my major, by the way, if any of you are thinking about it. But yeah, I'm just happy to be with you all. Thanks for hearing a little of my story. And I'd love to just answer any questions or engage in any dialogue that I can with you all. So thank you.
I have a mic if anyone has any questions. Over here. So you first. You want to say your name and maybe what year you are? Sure.
Hi, I'm Avril. Nice to meet you. I'm a current senior at Temple City High School. So being a board member, we have noticed that in our school district, it's not inclusive very much, and obviously it's hard for the community around us not to be inclusive for everyone. And I know that it might be a difficult thing to, switch over to become more inclusive, but do you have any advice on how we can advocate for that? Because I think our district and school really lacks that. And so I think it's important that we start building up on it now to make it better than having it keep affecting us in the long run.
Yeah, and thanks for naming it first and foremost. I think that is a brave thing to do, and particularly I'm assuming Temple City is maybe a little more homogenous. Like you might have, I don't know actually much about Temple City. Is it very diverse, or are there folks that are very similar?
It's mostly Asian American, and I want to say so it's mainly Asian Americans, and then I think there's a lot of also American people, and I want to say maybe 5%
It's like-
or like 10% might be people of color.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's not diverse like at all.
Well, and I think that's important to start with, right? Like who are we dealing with? You talk about inclusion, like who needs to be included and who is able to be included. And there's a lot of different ways. Race is obviously an important one in this country because we have a long history of race and racism in this country, but you could also think about ability. So in public education, we talk about inclusion a lot with special education. And if students on IEPs are included in the general public education setting. So it's a great question. How do you get more people to the table? How do you include folks? Well, first of all, like who's there? Who can be there? Because I think it's important to name also who's not there and why are they not there? What policies from the past have contributed, for example, to some people not living in your neighborhoods anymore or never having access to where you live or the school that you're in front of. So I think it's like who's here and who should be here, and can we recognize who's not here by bringing them in or asking people to just make space for it. So this is maybe a silly example, but when I was a middle school teacher, I used to have my students do this inclusion celebration. And I would ask you, like, stand up if you identify with. And I would say a bunch of different things, like if you are the first in your family who's going to go to college, if your parents immigrated to this country, if you speak another language at home, if you identify as Filipino, if you identify as Latino, if you identify, all these different things I would say to my kids. And then when no one would stand, I would say, why do we think no one's standing for this identity? Like, what about our neighborhood means that that kind of person isn't in our school? And so I think just to start with that, like who's here, can help with the conversation. And then what do we want inclusion to look like? Does it mean that we bring more people in, and what policies need to be, changed in order to make that happen? Some are really big, like housing. Housing is really expensive. Do we need a more affordable housing program in our city? Do we need to be friendlier to undocumented families? Do we need more dual language programs where we're honoring the history and culture of families that would like to be in our schools? So I think there are some things like that you can think about, but also just really visualizing what success looks like for you, whether it's inclusion or any other sort of social justice issue you want to take on. Defining success is really important, whether it's qualitative measures like surveys of how people feel about things, or if it's quantitative, like the number of seats that are filled by people of color in this decision-making body, right? So that, I think I would say, is probably even more helpful to define like what you want your future to look like. I hope that helped.
Yeah, that did. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
So, quick question.
Clap each other. Yeah, clap it up.
So is there a way we can go about changing what we learn in history? Because obviously, we have Black History Month, we have Hispanic Heritage Month, but why do we have to have only a month of it when we should be learning it? Like white history, we learn throughout the whole entire year. Why can't we learn about Hispanic or Asian history throughout the whole entire year? Why do we have to only focus like on white history? Like, is there a way that we can go about changing that?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I also serve on the California School Board, which is interesting because that's all 1,000 school boards in California meet together. And I just came from a legislative committee meeting in Sacramento yesterday, where different legislators are trying to propose different curriculum approaches in STEAM, for example, or in health education, just different things that legislators think students should learn. And the group started to talk about, who's really responsible for our curriculum? Well, right now it's local districts. Local districts choose which curriculum you want to purchase, but the state adopted standards that you have to show mastery of, or when you take your Smarter Balanced assessment, for example, or it's the College Board for APs, if any of you take those tests, right? There are these entities that decide what standards students need to learn. And so it's an interesting question of like, how do we decide or how do we change? Because it's almost like, well, who is your target? And this is like a politics and advocacy kind of question anyway, is the target is not like a bad thing. Like I'm not actually trying to get a bullseye with you, but the target is the decision maker who needs to flip. So for example, if you were advocating in my school district and you said, this textbook is a cruddy textbook, I'd rather have, a people's history of the U.S. as our curriculum, I would be one of the targets. There's 7 of us on the school board, and you'd say, okay, we need 4 votes to make a win. Which one is not with us? And we need to change them to get to 4, or which are the 4 that are with us? If it's for the State Board of Education, now they say which curricula that school districts can choose from, that's interesting because they're appointed, they're not elected to the by their body, by their constituents. And I think that body is close to like 15 different people. And who are they persuaded by? A lot of them are persuaded by the governor who appointed them, and a lot of them are persuaded by people who get in front of them and testify. So you could go to a hearing in Sacramento and you could testify and say, my curriculum sucks, I'd like something that's more representative of my community. So it's a really great question, and I think at the core of it is yes, you can change what you're taught, and it requires, in my mind, like not just one person having a really good idea, but a lot of people agreeing with that and making a lot of noise about it, so that your decision makers listen to you. Because the louder you are, the harder it is for us to ignore. These are intense questions. It's not like, what's your favorite color?
This is like adding on to that, because I know like my school has US history, which is like just like about the US, and then we also have world history, where we just learn about like the world wars and like how we got like Hawaii and Alaska too. But now my school offers an ethnic studies course, where I think there's only like 2 classes, but I know like some of my friends are taking it, and like some underclassmen are taking it, and they're actually like learning about the different races and the like historic background of each race. So yeah, I think we're like heading in that direction.
Yeah, I'm so glad you added that on, because that was a fight from people who said we need ethnic studies in our schools. And, California has really swung back and forth. So when I was a kid, there was a proposition called 187. And I remember I was in 6th grade and we said, oh, that's the police code for homicide. They don't even want us here. Prop 87 was about kids who were undocumented not having access to healthcare, public education, or any of the basic systems. And it was really frustrating, because you were like, who's making these decisions when the majority of kids in California are either immigrants themselves or their parents are immigrants? And like, you want us to not be able to access public education? I mean, it got overturned, but like, just that sentiment was so frustrating as a kid, to think this is going to pass in the state of California that we think is so progressive. Well, back in the 80s, 90s, it wasn't necessarily, but it's swung a lot. And California does have a lot more ethnic studies now. And so like the College Board is adding even an African-American history for AP, which I don't know if you've heard, Florida is like, we're not having that here. Florida's all anti anything like ethnic studies, critical race theory. So I'm grateful that we live in the state of California, and ethnic studies will be a graduation requirement. I think it's not your class, but either the class after or the class after, which is great, because when you make it a requirement, then school districts have to figure out how to make it available to you all. And honestly, like, that was years and years of fighting, of people saying, I want to be represented in what I'm learning, and white American history is not my American history. So can you teach me more? So I'm glad that's available for you.
And this is,
Yeah.
Okay, and then this is my question. So I remember talking to this senior that graduated last year, but she went to a school that was in LAUSD district, and she was mentioning how, like, she was just talking about to me as I was a junior, and like what I should do to like get into college and stuff. And she was like, so first of all, you want to talk to your like college counselor. And I was like, what is that? Because in my school, we like switch counselors every year. And I didn't even know that in some schools, like your counselor follows you throughout high school, or like you get college counselors, and like I had no idea. And I was like, wow. So I just want to ask, like, how can we see that in our schools?
Yeah, that's a great question of knowing who your target is, because in that situation, that is your school principal is your target, right? And the leadership body at your school, because that is not governed by a school board. That's not the state. That's not the country. That's a school decision. And if you get enough voices, maybe get a petition going or have a meeting with your principal and say, we want to loop with our counselor every year so they know us better, then that's a decision that you're right there at your school. You could change just by talking to the decision makers at your school, which is your principal. So I think you all are raising some really good questions. And one thing I would recommend is thinking about, like, who made this decision, who's going to change this decision, and that's who you have to go after. So in that situation, that's a school site decision. So talk to your principal. And the other person I would say, if you know, is your union rep, the teachers union rep, because they often have similar power, because the teachers have to be okay with that too. And the counselors have to want to do that for the principal to say, yes, we'll do something like that.
Okay,
But you
thank
could see that happen next year. Like you could make it happen this year so that next year's classes are impacted by the things that you and your classmates want to see changed. Like that could be immediate. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, especially like with you being a new mom, like how do you manage that? Because I feel like in our society, it's like it's either one way or the other. Like women are either nurturing, and if you're too soft, like you're taken as like weak. And it's like, how do you manage being like that strong, like work-oriented person, and also like a nurturing mother?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I am just figuring out. I follow a lot of Instagram accounts about that will like help me as I'm processing. But I was telling Kim, like I almost had to bring my baby today because her dad, my partner, was supposed to be doing something else. So it's helpful that he actually stayed home with her today. And you know, I think for me, a couple years ago, I read Brené Brown. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she writes about vulnerability as being strength. And she had this quote that always stood out to me because I felt it so deeply, that if you go to the movies or you see a sporting event and you see somebody being so vulnerable, just like putting themselves out there, like an actor or an athlete, like they're giving everything their all, and that's vulnerability. And we think it's strength in others, but weakness in ourselves. And I was like, oh, why is that, right? If I want to show my true colors, my vulnerability is like my emotions. I wear them on my sleeve. I cry all the time at home, especially with a baby. And, you know, I think that requires, honestly, a lot more women in leadership positions, in positions of power, to say like emotions, vulnerability, like that is our superpower. That is strength. It's like awesome to be joyful and to be loving and to be nurturing and to be caring. And all these things actually make us better human beings. But unless more of us are in decision-making power, like in positions of power, then like it becomes a side conversation. So, you know, a really silly situation, I say silly, but I don't mean silly, but you know, trivial, it's not even, is a pumping room. So I'm breastfeeding, and every few hours, like my body tells me my baby's gonna eat, but I'm at work, so I need a room to be able to breastfeed, right, or to pump. And there's 2 school board members who actually have babies right now. And we have this cruddy pumping room that's like right next to where all of our school police officers are, who are mostly men. And like, it's not great, but like, at least it locks, at least it has a sink, because it's the law now that you have to have a room like this in any building that has employees, more than 50 employees. But I think about it, I'm like, you know, 4 of us on the board are women, and we're all moms. And the person who made the decision about this room, like, isn't us, but we have more power than him. Like, shouldn't we make a better room than like what we're having to, you know, sit here every 3 hours and spend 20 minutes like making food for our baby? Like, it's little things like that where like if you had more women at the top, then you'd be more conscious, or systems would be more conscious of working moms. And I will say, you know, working at home is being a working mom. Like, it's a lot of work. I read this thing on an Instagram account, but then my partner did the math today, because he didn't believe me at first. In a given year, people work on average 1,900 hours. That's like, you know, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, like 48 weeks out of the year, because maybe you take some vacation, right? 1,900 hours. On average, a breastfeeding mom spends 1,800 hours feeding her child in the first year. Like, and then I'm also going to work, you know? So it's opening conversations like this, honestly. And if this room had been, you know, 90% men, I don't know if I would have had the same conversation. So thank you for raising it, and keep raising these issues, especially around women and girls. But I think also like men need to have these conversations too. Yeah, thanks.
How do you feel about the recent strike, and do you think we're gonna have a compromise anytime, or not just a compromise, but you think they'll get their point across and get their raise that they deserve?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we just landed a tentative agreement last night, which is great. So for folks who are not sure, our education workers, so our custodial staff, our bus drivers, our food service workers, they were on strike for 3 days in LA Unified. And then our teachers and counselors were sympathy striking with them. So we had almost 60,000 employees out of school for the last 3 days, which is why we had to close schools for students. And Mayor Karen Bass, yay, woman in leadership, actually brought the head heads of both, our superintendent, who's a man, and the head of the classified union, who's also a man, both great men, but I'm just going to say it took a woman to bring them together, and they had conversations over the last couple of days, and we were able to offer the 30% that, it's so interesting. Like, I'm on the board where I had been hearing for weeks from our budget team saying, like, we can't do 30%. It's just not possible. We're going to break the bank. We're going to go into the red in 3 years. And so we were giving as much as we possibly could. But then somehow over the last couple days, again, with the energy of the people, there was so much urgency that we were able to figure out how to offer the 30%. So it's creative. It's not like 30% raise all in 1 year. It's like 7% 1 year, $2 the next year, 6% the next year. And it's important because these earners, these workers earned on average $22,000 a year. Which is nothing in the city of LA, and now they'll be earning closer to like $34,000 a year, which is still very little. But the hourly the hourly wage is going to be $22.52, which will be the highest in all of LA City. Like minimum wage, I think for the city and county, like the $15, $16 range. So we've like lifted the bottom, which I think is really important. And this goes back to the equity question, right? So typically when workers ask for raises, they say everyone deserves 5% raise. And you're like, sure. But the people at the bottom who earn $20 an hour, 5% on $20 is different than 5% on $100. So if we're actually thinking about equity and helping those who have most historically been hurt, we would give more to those who are earning less at the bottom, right? So we might give them 10 and we might give them only 2. But that is a really hard conversation to have because the people at the top are the one with the power, and they're going to be knocking on your door being like, well, why didn't I get more money? When you want to give people what they deserve, absolutely. But if you're really trying to lift those who most need it, you really have to think differently. So yes, to answer your question, we did get to a tentative agreement. The strike has ended, which is interesting because the strike was actually about respect. It was an unfair labor practice strike, which was not about getting to the economic agreement, but it was about how people were treated. And I think that's really important too. And a big part of the conversation is people need to feel like they are respected and their work matters. And our custodial staff, our food service, our bus drivers, their work is really important, and we need to make sure that they get paid well. So thanks for asking the question.
Everyone back over here.
Just a question for you. Have you seen anything that's going to be helping with all the gun violence and drug abuse that's been going on in schools?
Yeah, that's a big one. So another thing school boards do is we look at expulsion cases, which is the hardest thing, and I hate doing them. And honestly, one of my fellow board members, almost every board meeting, she cries over the expulsion cases because the parents come in and they say, please don't expel our kid. But if you sell drugs in school, it's a recommended for expulsion. And we see a lot of that. Less on the guns. We do see a few, very, very, very few, thankfully. But the drug sales, and not just because, fentanyl is out there and one pill can kill, though that is huge, but it's, it's the cartridges, it's the vaping, it's the marijuana, it's the things that are legal if you're over 18, but a lot of middle schoolers are selling these things, and maybe they're helping out their older siblings, which is really hard. So, it's something we haven't figured out yet. And honestly, I would turn to you all because I do think young people have a much better answer than this. Back in the day, it would be like, just say no to drugs, but that's not really effective for everyone. It's normal for adolescents to be risky and to try new things. That is actually typical adolescent behavior, is a little bit of risk taking, hopefully with some safe boundaries. And that's the problem with fentanyl, is you might think you're getting a Percocet or an Oxycontin or something that is going to help get you through the next couple of hours for a test you're studying for or something. But in actuality, if it's laced with fentanyl, which the vast majority is something like nearly 100% of drugs out there on the streets these days are there. I mean, the new phrase is one pill can kill. So I don't know if that phrase is going to get to people, or if it's going to be young people just talking to each other and saying dude, you really don't need that. Or honey, just put that down. I don't know. We haven't figured it out yet.
Because there's been a lot of cases at my school. I don't know if it's at other schools, but it's only one specific race that's sort of targeted. It's more the Black and Hispanics, but we don't look at the Asian people, and most of the people that are at our school are the Asians that are selling, and they always attack us because they think that we're gonna, and I'm not gonna lie, some of like the Hispanic and Black people at our school do sell and do drugs, but they focus more on us and focusing on what's going on behind their backs because they have like a certain, I guess, stereotype about, Asians. They're gonna do good. They're good in school, good grades, but yet they're the ones behind the curtains actually selling all the drugs.
Ooh, that's hard. And that is the whole system of the criminal justice system in this country, right? I mean, I think the data plays out that there actually are more white folks who do crimes that they're just not caught for, or they're just not charged with the same level of offense. And it's already happening in schools, right? And so it's no wonder that it's happening outside of schools. And so that is not just an issue about, violence and drug sales. It's about anti-bias training. It's about anti-racist training. It's about the adults in the school, like looking at all kids with that lens. So again, this is not the I don't see color and everyone's the same and we're all equal. It's like, actually, we're all born with biases, or we're not born with them, but we're raised into them really, really quickly. And we have to acknowledge that. And we have to intentionally practice. I don't know if any of you have ever done the Harvard bias surveys online. You can just Google it, but basically you just take your two little fingers and it will say, match the word with the picture. And it's fascinating. You can do it with all different kinds of things, but most people start with race. So it's like Harvard anti-bias test if you want to Google it later. And basically it'll have a white face and a black face, and it'll say good and bad. And what you're supposed to do is match them up. And how fast your brain works tells you if you are more favorable to white people or more favorable to black people. And it will do the same for a couple other groups. And if you do it, you look at this and you're like, I'm not biased, but then you might come out one way or the other. It's very unlikely that it's going to be split perfectly down the middle. And so, to answer actually the question, I think it is about adults and even young people, as you're considering paths of leadership, to be really intentional about what do I see when I see somebody who looks different than me, when I see somebody who looks similar to me, because maybe my bias is because it's happening in my own family. And then what does that mean about who gets in trouble and what kinds of consequences they get, because often it will be the exact same offense having dramatically different consequences for students of color and for students with disabilities than it does for students who are non-disabled and who are white.
One last question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Has there been any talk about more help being put into the schools? Because around Temple, I know it's a lot around other areas too, but there's been a lot of new cases around our area that have been about suicides. There was just one of our students from another high school, San Gabriel. He hung himself across above the freeway. So I feel like a lot of other schools around our area and a bunch of other areas do need a lot more help with getting to really know students and see what they're really going through. Because I feel that's a counselor I feel kind of goes to for school and stuff. They don't really normally talk about what's going on at home and stuff like that. So is there any talk about getting more help with all the cases of suicides and stuff like that?
Absolutely. It's the number one incident report that I get emails about is suicidal ideation or behaviors, more than drug sales, more than fights, more than curse words. It's suicidal ideation, which is overwhelming. And it happens from elementary school through high school. And, in my district, because we're so large, we do have a lot of support for mental health. So you heard college counselors, there's academic counselors, and then we have social workers. And the social workers do the mental health piece, but we don't have enough. There are literally not enough social workers trained in the state of California for all the positions that we want to hire just in Los Angeles Unified. So if any of you are interested in social work, or if your friends are, going into mental health is huge. It's so important. And I think it's a big way to change the world, is to just demystify therapy is helpful. Therapy can help people, but also it's not the only way. I think, peer-to-peer conversations are really important. I wish we had more art therapy and pet therapy and nature therapy and all these other ways that you could just heal in schools and around schools. So yes, the state, actually, Superintendent Tony Thurmond put out a goal for 10,000 new counselors to come into schools because he knows it's such a big need. And so helping to pay for college for folks who want to go into counseling, but still, it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? It's going to take a long time to get there. And, ultimately, I think it's helpful to have professionals, clinical professionals in particular, but a lot of it is friends. Friends will know these things, particularly for, students who are thinking about dying by suicide. There's some connection that you can have to friends or family or somebody who's close to you that doesn't have to be a clinician. So yeah, it's a good reminder, check in on your friends, check in with each other.
Hi again. So I wanted to first off talk about how you mentioned, like, I guess checking up on your friends, you know, having more peer-to-peer conversations, because I'm actually a part of a group called Peer Listeners on campus, where it's basically peer-held therapy. We help students if they don't feel that comfortable going to counselors. And honestly, with like the new like staff and stuff, they don't really like pay attention to the program. They don't really like want to include it. And we also have therapy dogs that prior to COVID, we would bring them on campus. A peer listener would have them by their side the whole day in case the student needed the presence of a therapy dog. And I've been trying to like not fight with the administration, but kind of beg them to bring them back, because it personally, for me, it really helped me when I was a freshman. And they kind of keep just pushing it off. And like I even talked to my principal. I was like, hey, listen, like I know it's, you know, a difficult thing also because of COVID. Like it's just different regulations, especially for an animal to be on campus, right? Mm-hmm. But he still doesn't do anything about it. And I asked him, I was like, oh, what if I go present to the school board about it? And he was like, no, they're going to say no. And I told my facilitator for peer listeners, and she said that they had never had that problem. They just don't want to pay for the paperwork. But they had never paid for the paperwork prior to it. It was always the facilitators that were paying for it. And I don't know how to go about that, like to talk to the district about it and just ignore my principal, ignore him, see what I can do personally. Because honestly, the staff at our school are so careless, and it's honestly really upsetting to not get the advocacy we deserve.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. And that's hard, right? You want the people who you see every day to be your number one champions. And in that case, I will say that is a school board decision, because in LA Unified, we can't have pets on campus, which I'm really bummed about. And like, that's a policy we could change if we had people coming and telling us day after day, you know, change this policy, it really matters for us. Similarly, when I was in law school, actually, during finals week, they would bring in puppies and kitties, and it just like made everyone so much happier and like, you know, ready to take on finals. So I will tell you, in LA Unified in June of 2020, not long after the murder of George Floyd, we had a lot of students come and say, we need to reduce school police. Los Angeles has the largest school police force in the entire country because we pay for our own force. It's on a $50 million budget. And the students advocated over and over again, and they called their school board members, and they came to board meetings, and they wrote petitions, and they protested outside. And this was before I became a board member, but they reduced the budget by 25%. And that was because students were relentless. And sometimes it just takes being relentless to change decision makers' minds. Okay. And being big, like grow, you know, get people on your side, tell your story, and build up people's testimonials. So it can go a long way when you hear people's stories, especially now as a mom, when I'm at the board and I hear students, I hear parents, like I'm so much more impacted by what they're telling me. And then try to get meetings with them one-on-one, especially Zoom makes it so easy. I'm doing meetings like every other day on Zoom, you know, after school hours, just to hear from constituents, like what matters to you and how can I be a better policymaker for you. So yeah, go to the school board.
Cool. Okay, and another quick question. So I feel like in our district, the kids with disabilities aren't very much, I guess, not cared for, but like cared for, because for example, I have an IEP, and so I had a case carrier last year, and they didn't tell me until 2 weeks after we started the new school year that my case carrier wasn't on campus anymore, and that I didn't have a case carrier until I went and asked. And so I was like, how are you going to help me if you're not even telling me this? And then also we have a friend at school, and he the special education classroom, some of them require one-on-ones, and sometimes they don't have enough for them, or the one-on-ones that they have, they often like neglect them, and they'll like walk ahead of them. They won't pay attention to them, and I feel like it's really unfair, especially kind of knowing, you know, how I guess it feels to not be paid attention to, especially with people who need actual physical help. Mm-hmm. how do you think we should go about that? Like to talk about the school board to make it better and more efficient for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's a great advocacy opportunity for anyone who's interested in the federal government. Special education is actually one of very few federal programs, but it's never been funded more than 14%. So basically the federal government says, all local school boards, you have to offer students a free and appropriate public education, but you have to do it out of your own state budget. We're not going to give you any federal money for it. And this has been going on since the beginning of time. So if anybody wants to advocate for this is a national issue and every state is like up in arms about it. So we need more resources. And then when we get the dollars to pay for people, how do we recruit people? So the unions that we were just mentioning also include special education assistants for my district. And for this contract, we just increased their number of hours and we increased their pay an extra 5% for the folks that do the one-on-one because it's so hard to be a one-on-one. You're intensely supporting one student, but not every district can do that. But so, on some side, it's like incentivizing people to do the work. And then on the other side, it's holding them accountable to do the work once they're there. And that's really hard, but I imagine lots of you are already and will definitely be girl bosses in the future. And even if you love your employees, you still have to hold them accountable. You have to have evaluations. You have to have hard conversations. If they're not doing their job well, see what they need. Maybe there's something going on at home that you didn't know about that you can help with. Maybe they don't know how to do the job right and they just need coaching and support. So I think that it could be another layer of it is, you need the resources, you need the people, and then you got to hold them accountable when you have them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I don't know how much time we have left for questions. 10 more minutes. So anybody who hasn't yet asked a question, who wants to, yeah.
Hi. This is more of kind of like a statement that I kind of experienced, but in middle school, I was heavily bullied by a lot of kids for the way I looked. And so it was to the point where I did starve myself for quite some time. But at least I had the only, none of the people that the teachers, the principal and then the other teachers and the supposed care workers were there, did not care, even if I did tell them multiple times that I was being really bullied by these kids and for no apparent reason. I wouldn't pick on them. I was just minding my own business. And so there was this one teacher that did, my 7th grade teacher, and she was I miss her so much. She was absolutely wonderful. She always cared about my well-being when nobody else did. So that kind of that was kind of the beginning of my distrust for a lot of school members, teachers, and then the psychologists and counselors. I have been getting help lately, but it's still I still see it as a problem today with some kids because there are some kids that do come in to talk to my case carrier because I have an IEP. And they would start crying, or they would just rant about their day, and it was really heartbreaking to hear what they were going through. And the fact that school, the high school that I'm going to, doesn't do much about it, even if they do have psychologists and counselors. Counselors don't really help that much, and we're pretty low on psychologists. There's only 3. So yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm sorry that happened to you. And I'm sorry it happens to so many kids. Today somebody's getting bullied. Lots of kids are getting bullied. And, I think I appreciate you for sharing your story. Thank you for being so brave. And it reminds, decision makers in particular, we have to have good people in our system who are also supported, because sometimes I think about the staff might be too stressed out, or they have, too big of numbers. So I think across the state, the recommendation for counselors to students is 500 to 1. That's impossible to build a quality relationship when it's 1 to 500. And so we need more people, right? So again, for those of you who are thinking about this, or people who are thinking about going into the service industry, I think people often think service industry is being a waitress or a waiter, but it could also be, serving in a mental health capacity. It could be public service, being an elected official. There are just so many different ways that you can make an impact in your world. And so thinking thinking critically about like, what is your mark there, I think is important. And then if you see people like, hey, you're a good listener, maybe you should go into social work or you should be a therapy, like nudge your friends on too, because we do need more good people. And then also when people are helpful, like tell them, because I don't think enough educators know, like your teacher in 7th grade, like I don't know how many people told her that she was really helpful. So if you have people in your lives who are making a difference, like let them know, because it also helps uplift them and helps them keep going. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rebecca. I was kind of like wondering how you would navigate this kind of situation that I've seen going around on my school too. And it's like, I want to say, because it's kind of hard to navigate where it's like, it's not like, oh, it has to do with exactly money. So it's like, oh, it's not something that they can really like, oh, we need to raise money or we just need to focus money on this or this. But I've noticed how some students at my school, they'll just get like really picked on and stuff like that, like just for their pronouns, for the way they love, for different things, how they look. And how would you like navigate talking to teachers about it? And like, because it's not like, you can't exactly control what another person does. You can only control what you do. But how would you navigate talking to like our teachers and getting this kind of issue solved? And not exactly, obviously you can't solve it in one day, but we can do something to make it better.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think that was really wise that you said, you can't force other people to act any certain way, or you can't change other people. You can just change how you react to how other people are treating you, which is really hard, but that's really wise. I think the most effective school cultures that I've seen really are intentional from the beginning of the year and ongoing. And so if your classrooms don't have like a process for developing norms or like rules of engagement, like encourage your teachers, hey, you might want to start each semester, or, it's never too late. You could start on Monday. Like, how do we want to treat each other? And these are very simple questions, but you ask the class, right? Like, how do you want to be treated? How do you want your others to treat you? How do you want to treat your teacher? And then what are we going to do about it when we don't operate with that, like those norms of engagement? And that's the harder part, right? So I've been in adult spaces where we've done this before, and it's been silly. They've said like, okay, if you don't treat people the way you're supposed to be treated in here, you have to do a yoga pose for like 2 minutes. Like it was like a jokey thing, but then you'd see people up there like, oh, I was late and you told me not to be late, so here I am. But I think that is a hard conversation to have, but to keep having it. And so, it happens as young as elementary school, but I think in high school, it's just as important to like put it on the wall and say, these are our agreements. You can have people sign it. The harder part is going to be, instituting it in the bathroom, in the hallway, out, on the yard. And I think it has to be real. It has to be like authentic conversations where people really say, here's what it sounds like. Here's what it looks like to treat each other with respect, if that's a word that you want to use. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it sounds like to listen to each other, from the heart, like with empathy. If your class decides like, joy is an important value to you, or caring or trust or respect, honesty, if any of these things are important to you, like really visualize what does that look like and then come back to it. And, it is hard for a teacher to hear that from a student. Like, I feel disrespected in this class, or, there's a trend going on out in the hallway you might not know. Can we make some space for how we treat each other? You might find like a teacher leader. Maybe it's a leadership teacher or the union chair or the department chair, or a principal or a counselor, somebody who's like really respected by their peers, because then they can also influence their other colleagues to say, I've heard from other students, have you heard this? That like, we really need to have a norms conversation. We need to have like a respect or a treatment conversation. But the harder part in my mind is then what do you do when people break the rules or they, violate your trust? Like, what is a meaningful enough consequence that isn't just punishment to kick kids out, but is going to change the hearts and minds of people? So before I was a school board member, I spent some time doing restorative justice, where you sit in a circle, you pass a talking piece, and you say, what happened, how did it make you feel, and what needs to happen to make things better. And that's really hard. It's really hard for people to be honest after things have occurred, but that is like a really powerful question. What needs to happen to make things better or make things as right as possible? And for everyone, like considering your own part in it and then thinking about what other people can do. Again, you can't force them to do it, but you could say the situation would be better if this person did this thing. And it's not always like a forced apology, because that doesn't usually, in my opinion, that doesn't always go as far as you need it. And sometimes it's about, just not interacting, which is really unfortunate. And other times it's about like sitting together at lunch and trying to have a real conversation about your families. Because sometimes when you connect on a personal level, it gives you insight into someone in a way that like causes you to respect them in other places. So it's really hard. Again, thank you for raising that. And sounds like there might be some teachers in the back who are maybe thinking like, what does this look like for my school? And yeah, I think just, raising it as being brave. And then for any of you who might be having something similar, like talking to someone about it one-on-one, I think a teacher will really respect you for that.
I also just want to mention, I feel like one issue is like how people are just not informed, and they're just like they don't know, and like if we don't tell people about like the mistakes that they made, or like if like, hey, you treated me like this, they're never gonna learn. And I remember in my psychology class we were learning about like we since it's class, like you had to watch the video that the teachers put on because it's part of the lesson, and we were learning about sexual orientations, and like it was like I noticed like some students in that classroom were homophobic, and it was the first time that they had to like sit there and learn about it. And then like I could kind of see like changes after they were like kind of forced to sit there and learn about it. But I feel like the issue is people not being open to listen, and also just not being uninformed.
Yeah. And then that's hard on the person who feels like they have to be the representative of their group to teach people about their group, right? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's tough. Did we have one more, or that's the last one? And yes, I'm happy for you to share my information too afterwards if anyone wants to follow up.
Hello. I have a question about gun violence. So yesterday, my school was forced to go on lockdown for 6 hours because there was potentially a gun on campus. So they had the police come and like everything. And I just wanted to ask, the problem wasn't how the school administration handled it, because they actually handled it very well. My question is, what's the district's plan on actually preventing these guns from entering campuses on the first place? Like, do you actually have a plan for that, or like, what's your?
That's so hard, because the plan is, see something, say something. The plan is we have a rule that says you can't do this. There's not going to be a plan, in my opinion, about like metal detectors on campus. There was a time a while ago, or you might have seen, movies where they had metal detectors on campus. I actually don't think that is a solution, because it takes things away from like the culture that you're trying to work on in your school. There's a lot of delays then getting to class, and you're losing learning time. And like, is it really going to prevent someone to bring a gun if they know there's a metal detector on campus? It's going to pick it up anyway. As hard as it is, I think a lot of solutions to these really big challenges are just having like meaningful relationships with people. Because if you bring a gun to campus, it tells me that there's something going on. In the few instances that it's happened in my district, it's often on the passage to and from school, where kids will say like, I needed this for protection for my my walking to and from. And that is like so heartbreaking, because then it feels like, well, can the school district do enough? Like, do we have, gang interventionists? Do we have police? Who do we have out on the streets where kids can walk at home to and from school safely? Sometimes we've actually had kids bring it because they think it makes them look cool. And they've said, I just want to show people this because I have it. And I think in that situation, like, it is about the culture of the young people, for peers to say like, that's not a cool thing to bring to school, whether it's a gun or a knife or any other sort of weapon. Like, that sort of status, I think, has to be changed by young people to say like, that doesn't impress me. Like, you're not cool if you bring something like that. So it's a really hard and complex question, and I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. But I will say, I think one of the best preventions is just healthy relationships, people who can have conversations, people who have trusting friends, who can go to adults that they, believe will support them. And feeling safe means that you don't have to bring things like that to campus. It's a hard one. You guys are asking amazing questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, big round of applause.
Oh,
Then yeah, I'll share
It would be awesome if you could share information. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, actually, I'll share with you now if you want to just write it down. My contact information for fun is on social media at LAUSD BD7. So LAUSD BD7. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I know that's probably more for your parents. We are on TikTok, but like not very well, so don't follow my TikTok yet. And then professionally, my email is Tanya, Tanya, Franklin, Franklin, Tanya.Franklin at LAUSD.net. But probably the most fun way to follow us is on social media. You'll see a lot of fun pictures, a lot of cool events. We try to have fun stories. So LAUSD BD7 is our Insta handle.
Oh. Okay, everyone. Big round of applause again.
Applause for you all. Oh my God.